I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well,
Okay, let's pause there. Let's just deal with this question right now. Why does God allow suffering? I believe Christians answer this question wrong. And what I mean by that is they try and justify God's actions and why God allows suffering. And I don't think that's the right thing to do, because God himself didn't tell us exactly why it is that he allowed suffering. Excuse me. We can speculate and we can think about all the different reasons why, and honestly, those reasons could be valid, but ultimately, at the end of the day, God himself didn't put his signature on it and say, this is exactly why I allowed suffering. Now, here's a really important lesson to learn about suffering. One of my favorite stories, or rather, one of the stories that used to scare me the most in the Bible is the story of Job. Most of you are probably, or some of you are probably familiar with the story of Job. Let's just go ahead and give a brief recap about what it is so that way for the people that don't know the story can understand. All right. The story of Job is about a man who is considered righteous before God's eyes. Okay. This man used to sacrifice for the sake of his children's sins, for the sake of himself. He was considered upright and noble, and he was considered a man of God, righteous among all the land. Guess what happened to this man who was considered righteous before God? Every single thing that could happen to a person that we care about, financially, relationships, health, wealth, and relationships, the big three. This man lost all three. Now, what is this righteous man who's considered noble in God's eyes, who God is pleased with? He loses his children. He loses his land and is part of his wealth. His relationship with not only obviously his children was gone, but also his relationship with his wife was damaged because his wife seemed to have resented him because of the fact that he wouldn't curse God and die. So, three areas: health, wealth, and relationships, all challenged and taken away from Job. The very things that would destroy the 99% of humanity, he faced them all at once. Now, why is this story important? Well, because you had suffering not just with a man who was committing sin left and right. You had suffering with a man who was considered righteous in God's eyes by the way that he lived. Now, if you have this man who's considered upright and noble, why did suffering happen to him? So the question is, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? See, we're willing to accept when suffering happens to bad people, but when suffering happens to people who we feel like do not deserve it, these are the moments, these are the situations that we question God's character. Now, here's the thing. Job had an issue with this. So what did he do? Although he didn't sin against God by cursing God or doing anything like that, he questioned God and he asked him, why? Why did you allow this to happen? So Job probably had a little bit of a mindset of, well, I do all these things. I consider you in all my ways. I sacrifice for you, and I do things to be able to honor your name in all the ways that I can. Why did this happen to me? And do you know what God's response to him was? What do you think God's response was? Did God come down and say, Job, here's why I did that. Certain things going on in heaven. I had a conversation with Satan, and actually, there's a lot about this going on, and blah, blah, blah. No. God didn't do any of that. Instead, God came down and he questioned Job. He said, Job, stand up like a man and let's see if you can answer these questions. So God starts asking Job a series of questions. Where were you when the earth was created? Where were you when the oceans were divided? Where were you when I set the boundaries and the foundation of the earth? Where were you when I set this, that, and the other, the birds in the air and all these different things? How do you know? What do you know about this ancient mammal? What do you know about the Leviathan? What do you know about this? What do you know about that? All of these questions, could Job answer them? Of course he couldn't. And that was the point. God did not justify why he did what he did. He simply put Job in a position where he had to acknowledge his ignorance on the grand scheme of the universe. And in acknowledging our ignorance in the grand scheme of the universe, can we only truly humble ourselves before God. Now, why is this important? Let's go back to any of the stories in the Bible. You see, let's take the story of the Israelites in Egypt. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, yes? When he brought the Israelites out of Egypt, what did he do? He told them, I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. What happens after they get out of the land of Egypt? They go through a desert wasteland. They barely had food. They barely had water. And they were tested by God himself with the very opposite of what it is that he said he was going to give to them. God tells you he's going to give you a land with milk and honey, and you're in the wilderness. God tells you he's going to bless you with a son in the story of Abraham, and your descendants are going to be made through this son. And then God asks you to kill your son, to sacrifice your son. God comes down in the form of Jesus. As the Son of God comes down as Jesus comes down as the second person in the Trinity, the Son of God, tells people, I'm not from here. Well, from the people standpoint, he was born by Mary. He was called a Nazarene. But what Jesus was actually talking about was he's not from here, he's from heaven. So what is the point I'm making? When God tells you something with his word, if God said that he's good, even if everything in your sight, even if everything appears to be the opposite of what he said, the ultimate question that you have to ask yourself is, do I trust God? The question of suffering is the wrong question. I'm not saying it's a foolish question to ask. I understand it. I think it's a very natural question. But you'll run in circles with trying to justify why God doesn't allow or why God does allow suffering. The truth of the matter is we don't know every little bit of the dynamics and the nuances that go into the reasons why God does what he does. But the question that every single Christian has asked themselves is this: no matter what I see, if God said that he is good and that he is love and that he loves and desires that humanity will be saved, if God himself is love and everything in the creation seems to be the opposite of what a benevolent God would do, you have to ultimately ask yourself the question in faith, do I trust God?